And let me just say good morning to my fellow Gen Xer Neil, and it's good to share a studio with Glenn the Boomer.
It's nice to bring the age down a little bit, you know?
Okay, let's move on. That you would have both Beijing and Paris equally angry at the U.S., the UK,
staggering story,
and Australia. AUKUS is our next story. Talk to us, first of all, what does AUKUS mean? Why did they come up with such a ridiculous acronym? And what's the story behind the tail of the submarine?
Well, they could have used, AUS UK, which would have been all you sucks. So I think AUKUS is greatly preferable to AU sucks.
See,
which is probably what they're calling
talk show host analogy. That was better.
That's why you get paid the big bucks as a business consultant.
They may be calling it that in Paris and Beijing. I mean, I think
indeed they are.
Yeah, this is you can't really underestimate how big a deal this is. And doing show prep, I talked to a friend of mine who's former U.S. Department of Defense, and asked him, why does this matter so much from a military perspective? And the difference between the diesel subs that the Aussies were going to buy from the French as opposed to a nuclear propulsion sub is, one, it's the range, right? You don't have to go back and forth to refuel. So you can be out literally forever. I mean, your limitation is based on the crew, not on anything else. Second, you can make them much larger, which means you can put a lot more ammunition on them. You can put a lot more missiles on them, which means after you fire, you can fire again and you can fire again. And so your offensive capabilities go way up with these nuclear subs. These are the crown jewels of defense. And the US and the UK have been very guarded on this since 1958. Bringing Australia into this, giving Australia nuclear propulsion submarines, makes Australia a player in the South China Sea. It makes Australia a player in North Asia. It makes Australia a player in the Indian Ocean. And the Chinese weakest part of their military is below the surface of the ocean. And so this is a real game changer militarily and politically and potentially economically.
Well, you're absolutely right, Steve. I mean, that's an understatement. I was just reading this morning that France has recalled ambassadors from these countries. They are not amused. We're talking billions of dollars here. Apparently, guys, I mean, you've probably read this. The Australians and the French were still meeting about their supposed defense submarine agreements long after negotiations must have began between the Americans, the Australians, and the Brits. So bearing all that in mind, Steve, the Australians in particular must have anticipated the fallout. And therefore, does that not underline how serious they see the Chinese threat in the Indo-Pacific region?
Absolutely. And first, as you say, the French are furious, and the French have recalled now their ambassadors from Washington and Canberra. And that does not happen between allies. Now, tellingly, they did not recall their ambassador from London. But that is a huge way of showing your extreme displeasure. But the question is, one, what are the French going to do? What is their reaction going to be? And don't forget, there's an election in France coming up. So how much of this is for the domestic audience in France? How much of this is for making sure Macron wins and his party wins and stays in power? So there is some politics going on around their real and rightful anger. But the Australians are saying the world has changed. Actually, the Australians are saying China has changed from when we signed this contract in 2016 with the French. And now that we have the opportunity to get nuclear propulsion submarines, and now that the Biden administration, as opposed to the Trump administration, says the way to take on China is not unilaterally, but through alliances, it's a game changer in the EU, it's a game changer in Australia, it's a game changer in Asia Pacific, and it's a game changer in Washington.
And Steve, you touched on it there just a moment ago, but Lily Ong, who you know well, is one of our regular Facebook live listeners, and she's saying, the recall of the ambassadors aside, what actual retaliation could we see from France toward the UK, US, and or Australia? I mean, really, do they have much hand at this point to do anything?
I mean, any long-term significant? No. and nor is it in their interest to do that. And alliances can get mended over time. The Japanese were furious at the United States when Nixon opened up to China without telling Japan. This shocked Japan back in the 70s, where when the U.S. normalized relations with China without notifying the Japanese. The U.S.-Japanese is as strong an alliance today as it's ever been. These things will be overcome. And so there isn't really, it's not in France's interest long-term to do anything. And it's in the U.S. and Australia's interest and the U.K.'s to mend ties with France. That'll be taken care of.
Well, Ian Chan is asking on Facebook Live, will this mean that the French would now align more with the Chinese? I think there's an obvious answer to that over this incident.
Who do the Chinese align with, right? And who do they have alliances with? And the answer is not really anyone, right? I mean, is Iran alliance? Is Pakistan alliance? Is Russia an alliance for the Chinese? No, not certainly in the sense that the U.S. and Australia and Japan and Korea and the EU have alliances. And what are the Chinese going to do, right? The Chinese have already gone after the Australians. The Chinese have gone after the Australians. They've arrested Australian citizens in Japan. They've used their economic coercion when the Australians didn't do what they liked when it came to the origins of COVID. So they slapped massive tariffs on it, right, when it came to wine and the like. The China uses economic coercion when countries don't do what they want them to do, like they did with South Korea when they accepted the THAAD missile defense, and then they went after Korean companies operating in China. So China's already doing all of those things. So what else are you going to do other than what the move we see now between, AUKUS?
Just to express anger. Okay, let's move on. Big visit, regional visit. Beijing is trying to prop up some of its relationships. Speaking of Beijing, Southeast Asian neighbors, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, his second tour of the region. He's starting 3-day visit in Vietnam on Friday. Then he goes to Cambodia to spend a little money. And then he goes to Singapore, and then he goes to Seoul. They're really going all out. One would assume in some measure to counter Vice President Kamala Harris's trip here a few weeks ago.
And I remember, kind of segue from the other story. Scott Morrison 3 years ago, when he became Australia's prime minister, he said that the country is going to maintain close ties with China, its largest trading partners, and it will work with the United States too, but it's not going to choose between the two. Right? Australia chose, and they chose in the most public, aggressive way possible. Singapore, ASEAN is in that position that Australia is in. They don't want to choose between the U.S. and China. They want to be able to work with both. It is no surprise, Glenn, as you mentioned, after Vice President Harris has a successful visit to the region, after Secretary Austin has a successful visit to Southeast Asia, both coming to Singapore, that the foreign minister from China comes here because they want to show that countries in ASEAN don't need to make a choice, that they can be both with the United States and with China. It's tough to do that sometimes, but that's the message that they wanted to deliver.
And when he comes here and to Southeast Asia, does the AUKUS agreement change anything? Will it make conversations awkward in any way?
Well, I mean, I think it could, and it certainly change when you change the dynamic. Now we have to keep in mind these submarines are not coming, into service for a decade or longer. I mean, the U.S. and the U.K. are going to spend 18 months working with Australia to even just study and prep what these should look like. So this is going to play out over time. But it certainly shows that Australia, which didn't want to choose, has chosen. And what's interesting, I found, was when the foreign minister was in Vietnam, the foreign minister said to his counterpart in Vietnam, we have our disagreement in the South China Sea. And Vietnam is very adamantly opposed to what China is doing in taking all those territorial claims in the South China Sea. So China's saying, we could put South China Sea to the side, and then we can cooperate where it's in our interest to cooperate as China and Vietnam. China's saying the exact opposite thing to the United States. China is saying to the United States, you want to cooperate with us on climate? Knock it off when it comes to you're saying there's genocide in Xinjiang. Knock it off when you're saying that we're abusing human rights in Hong Kong. Knock it off when you're saying that you're going to, engage with Taiwan. So China has a different approach when it comes to what it wants to do versus what it wants other countries to do. And how is this all going to work out with this new power dynamic in the Indo-Pacific? Very good questions to watch.
Awesome, Steve. Hey, Steve, if you don't mind sticking around on Facebook Live and in the chat, there's a lot of questions and comments there. If you wouldn't mind replying to that, including some questions about Singapore's position on this with AUKUS, etc.
AUKUS.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, Steve.
Make it quick, Steve.
You've one up me with that magnificent T-shirt you have there. You see,
Rupert.
For the benefit of our listeners, I sometimes wear a T-shirt from my favorite movie, Robert De Niro movie, The King of Comedy. Steve asked me about it, and he's gone out and bought a better one than mine. That's a much better T-shirt, Steve. I love it.
How can I top that clothes?